we need to have GST on the table. We need to say, can we broaden GST? Can we increase the rate of GST? That is a broad tax that would change the nature of how we raise revenue, that would have productivity implications, would have fairness implications. Those need to be thought about.
The Treasurer says sensible progress on productivity can't happen in the absence of tax reform. Can you explain the scale of the economic challenge facing the government?
So the Treasurer raised a really considered point about the fact that we have a productivity issue, a budget sustainability issue, and a resilience issue that are all related to each other. And with that, tax reform solves every single one of those issues in different ways. When we look at the government budget, there's about a 2 percentage point gap in terms of GDP between what's being spent and what's being received. That's about $50 to $60 billion.
Okay, and if the government was to increase spending, say in the area of defence, a hot topic right now, it would need to find more.
That would be about another $30 billion.
Okay. Jim Chalmers has left the impression that he's open to enacting reform before the next election if a change has broad support. Are there tax measures the government might be able to easily wave through before the next election?
Well, I think anything that's going to raise a lot of revenue, that's not going to be the case. And so to truly solve a lot of these issues, that's just not going to be on the cards. Tax reforms that might be possible through this process is something like accelerated depreciation. It's likely the Productivity Commission will mention similar things, but that's another expenditure and they'll be banking on that lifting productivity and paying for itself, which is unlikely to be the case.
The Treasurer didn't want to rule in or out possible measures, but it does certainly sound like he's not a fan of increasing the GST. Are there reasons why he should be?
Well, I think ruling that out, even as partially as he did, is a mistake. I think ultimately, if we're talking about true tax reform, not changing tax rates, not changing tax scales, but truly reform, we need to have GST on the table. We need to say, can we broaden GST? Can we increase the rate of GST? That is a broad tax that would change the nature of how we raise revenue, that would have productivity implications, would have fairness implications. Those need to be thought about and worked through.
The GST stands at 10% currently. What should it be?
Well, that's a great question. So at my work, we have great discussions about this. Some people talk about as high as 25%. Some would say keep it at 10%. And what underlines all of that is asking ourselves, how large are we comfortable with government being? How much do we want government to provide services? When we look at Scandinavian countries, they have higher, broad taxation that everyone pays because they're paying for much larger government services.
And so what are some more of the bigger reforms that the government should be considering but might be more politically challenging to pull off, that might require an electoral mandate?
Well, when we look at the income tax schedule and we see that there's a lot of different deductions and discounts for capital gains, if we truly believe that capital gains should be taxed as if they're any other income, $1 for $1, then we should tax them at the same rate. If we don't believe that, then we need to adjust the way we're taxing all forms of income that are like capital gains, interest income, dividends, and that needs to be considered.
And so it does sound as though even if we end up paying less income tax as individuals, we may be paying a greater amount of tax overall. Is there any way to estimate just how much tax we'll likely end up paying?
Oh, that's a great question. So if we imagine a world where we just have what's called bracket creep, so we don't change the tax system at all now, and we just let inflation push everyone into higher tax brackets, that would make the average full-time worker in Australia go from a tax rate of 20.7% to 23%. And that would be necessary to achieve budget balance. So we're saying the average full-time worker should pay 2.3% more of their earnings in order to achieve that.
Now, we haven't talked about measures such as the resource rent tax, for instance, or other taxation measures impacting big business. Should we be?
Well, I think they're important when you're thinking about a whole of system reform and what sort of taxes can be used. But income and expenditure taxes are the basis of the tax system. In the end, we will have to tax income and we will have to tax expenditure, and that's going to be most of the revenue. If we want to think about environmental costs, we should talk about a carbon tax. But if we want to think about budget sustainability, those two big taxes are the ones we should look at.
What is your sense of how open Australians are to this broader tax reform conversation?
I think that's a great question. There's a feeling in the public or around economists that people are resistant to talking about costs for themselves. But if we explained what the trade-offs were and we talked about what these reforms mean, then we can get people to buy into a situation where they know it's principled. Principles about these reforms are what's important, and that's what should be discussed at this round table, not esoteric little changes to the tax system.
Matt Nolan, good to speak to you.
Thank you.